welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests and discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. Just a reminder before we move on, you can still find us on Stitcher. Just navigate over there and search for Service on Celluloid and you'll find us. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And our special guests for today's episode are Adam Foreman, student program specialist here at the museum.
Hey, Seth.
Dave Walker, communications specialist here at the museum.
Thanks for having me.
And Amber Mitchell, the museum's assistant director of public engagement.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we will be discussing the 1988 Japanese film Grave of the Fireflies. Grave of the Fireflies centers on the struggles of two young Japanese children after the firebombing of Kobe in 1945. The film follows the children Seita and Setsuko as they attempt to navigate their way through the wreckage of Kobe and attempt to survive amidst dwindling food supplies, lack of medical treatment, and the Japanese surrender. Grave of the Fireflies was directed by Isao Takahata and written by Takahata and animated by Studio Ghibli. So as we start all these conversations, I will ask, and I will start with you, Adam, because you're sitting right next to me here, to my right. In your opinion, how accurate is Grave of the Fireflies?
So, this one was a little bit tricky for me. So I think the depiction of the firebombing and the depiction of the experiences of civilians was relatively accurate. However, being that it is meant to be a kind of a whimsical story about one's afterlife, it obviously has a lot of play on artistry there.
But you, Amber, what do you think?
Well, I mean, they use their magical realism, right, which is a reoccurring thing in anime, of telling a really hard story but using spiritualism in the form of fireflies or the way they draw it out to make it a bit more palatable. As far as accurate goes, I think it was probably accurate from a child's perspective, for it to feel really overwhelming, for you to feel alone and really kind of desperate. I think that came across very well in the film. So that particular part is pretty accurate, in my opinion.
Dave?
I agree with all. I think it is accurate to a point to the civilian experience in Japan during the summer of 1945. I think for sure it's accurate to and true to the short story on which it's based, which was written by someone who was a teenager in Kobe during the bombing, and who lost actually two sisters to malnutrition, lost his father, and who dealt with confronted suppressed memories of all that through his writing some 20 years later. And I think the film is actually a very accurate representation of those memories as captured in that short story. And I was so glad I got to, for the first time, find this piece of writing, because it was very powerful and now accompanies my thinking of the story of the end game in Japan.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Dave. I think the movie is an accurate depiction of the story. And I think there are some accuracies, in the film as far as, the malnutrition and that was suffered by the Japanese, or that the Japanese people were suffering through, I should say, especially in, the late part of the war in 1945. I think that is accurate. But being that it is an animated film, it does have a sense of, obviously, fantasy too, to it. I mean, the whole Fireflies thing is there's definite elements of fantasy to it. So it's it has some elements of accuracy and some not. So, but the film does spend a good amount of time, and rightfully so, on the firebombing campaign on Japan. And how accurate is this depiction, and how constant was it in you guys' opinions? And we've all been here for a very long time, and we talk about the firebombing of Japan in our Road to Tokyo exhibit. So this is not something that we shy away from here at the museum. What do you guys think?
So I actually looked up some details on this, and one specific part that really kind of caught me off guard in the film was whenever the very first bombing attack that they where the mother was still alive, the very first one, where they were dropping just those canisters. And I was very curious as to what that was. So I did some digging, and those were actually representing thermite bombs, which didn't have an explosion. It just sent out the sparks just to start a fire. And Kobe actually underwent 4 really devastating, indiscriminate bombing runs, firebombing runs during February, March, and June in 45. And in February, the United States started using napalm in their bombs instead of thermite. So the bombings were much more intense. The fires were much hotter and much more widespread. They started doing low-level flights, about 5,000 or 6,000 feet, I think they flew at. So very low-level flights. So the imagery in the film where you literally saw the planes and you can read the numbers on them, that would have been relatively accurate. They were flying pretty low for these napalm bombing runs.
No, that's true. The tactics were shifted. The Army Air Forces were, at this time, they were based out of the Marianas Islands. And those, for those who don't know, that's generally the main islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And the 20th Air Force was taken over by General Curtis LeMay in 1945. And he was sent over there basically to rectify a problem. And that problem was the strategic bombing of Japan. The B-29ers went about bombing Japan as if they were bombing Germany. They followed the same strategic steps and the same tactics. I should say strategic steps is not the proper term. Tactics would be the more proper term, which is high-altitude precision bombing. One thing that the B-29ers had to deal with over Japan that the B-17ers and the B-24 crews didn't have to deal with over Germany and occupied Europe was this thing that was unknown to them at the time. It's called the jet stream. And from high altitude, the 29s would drop their bombs theoretically on target, and the jet stream would literally push the bombs off target. So they weren't hitting anything, or they weren't hitting anything with much result.
Value,
yeah. They weren't doing what they were there to do. And they were dropping high explosive bombs and anti-personnel weapons, just like they were doing in Germany. And it was not achieving the results that the United States Army Air Forces wanted, which was to bring Japan's manufacturing ability to its knees. And as we know, well, as we should know, that in the 1930s and 40s, Japan was a country made of wood. Their cities were wooden. Obviously not every building was wooden. Tokyo was, and Kobe and Hiroshima, they were all, modern cities to a point, but
the industrial areas were modern.
The industrial areas were, but Tokyo especially was a modern city, but that being said, the outlying parts of those cities and the parts where people lived, where the houses and the buildings were made of wood and paper, and this is a fact. And in order to get to the cottage industry, so to see Japan, and this is a very long conversation, and I'm not going to make it as long as I could. Japan had an industry that was based on a cottage industry. So they did have mass production factories, but a lot of their factories produced pieces for like the Japanese Zero or rifle parts or whatever in small areas and inside of towns, inside of cities. And we knew this. And in order to get to those, civilians are going to die. And the best way to get to those targets was firebombing. And General Curtis LeMay came in and changed the tactics and said instead of going in at 25,000 feet during the daylight, we're going to come in at 5,000 feet at night and we're going to burn the cities to the ground. And that's exactly what they did. And that is what's remembered by Japanese survivors of the war more than anything else in terms of American bombing campaign. Sure, they probably do remember some of the early bombing raids because they didn't really do a whole heck of a lot, but they started coming in at night. And when they started coming in at night at those low levels, it was absolutely terrifying to the people on the ground and the people in the planes too. I should mention.
I was going to ask: have you talked to B-29 crew members who were part of this action?
Oh yeah.
And how I never question anybody in anybody's motives, but do they reckon with the destruction? Was it? They were on board with the tactics? Do they think back on – the aerial photos of the cities after the fact are profound.
Oh, yeah.
How devastating this tactic was. I'm wondering in the opportunities you've had to talk to them if they talk about that.
Oh, yeah, they do. And you got to remember most of these guys that we're talking about here, were, 20, 22, 23, a little bit older maybe, some a little bit younger even. And they were there, they were doing what they were told. Now, of course, that's always the easy way out, And of course, you're going to sit there and you're going to think about burning the city to the ground, for sure. Absolutely. I remember one guy, I think his name was Richard Bale. I did not interview him personally, but I remember going through his oral history when we were putting stuff in the Road to Tokyo. And he talked about, if I remember correctly, he was talking about the March 10th, 1945 raid on Tokyo, which was called Operation Meeting House, in which over 110,000 people were killed. He talked about the fires were burning so brightly on the ground that he could read a newspaper inside the B-29 at 5,000 feet or 6,000, whatever it was exactly. So
yeah, in that raid in Tokyo, the temperature on the ground got upwards of 1,800, almost 2,000 degrees just on the ground.
Oh yeah.
So it got extraordinarily intense.
Yeah, and they could feel the heat in the airplanes, and they would the firestorms that were created by these attacks. And I'm not a meteorologist, so I can't exactly say exactly what they were called, but they could flip the airplanes upside down because the winds were so strong that because of the firestorms. And guys talk about that, about how one minute they're upright and the next minute they're inverted in the B-29 because the winds had actually flipped the airplane over before the pilot could realize what the hell was going on. So I mean, these were horrible, 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 horrible raids, and they were designed to bring a population to its knees and bring a government theoretically to the negotiating table, although of course it was unconditional surrender. And it worked. It worked. It accomplished its mission, in my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I thought about the real raids as I watched this, and it's this poetic, almost pastel-colored depiction of it is such a challenging juxtaposition, but because there are moments when the planes, especially where in the distance, don't look that threatening, and then there'll be the moment where the canisters are dropping and the plane is right overhead, and that horror is tangible.
Sure.
In the film.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta, I remember hearing, and this is on a sort of a different subject, but sort of the same thing. I remember hearing when I was searching through archival stuff for something here, I don't remember what, I heard a German recording of a night radio broadcast, and it was basically like, we interrupt this program, and it was in German, and it was basically telling people that the RAF was coming, and they were coming, I forget what city it was for, it might have been, Dusseldorf or something, I don't remember. And it's just this very dull, monotone voice. And if you hear it, even if you don't understand German, if you hear it, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Because, you got to remember these people are sitting there sleeping, theoretically, we're sitting around the fireplace, whatever. And all of a sudden the radio bursts on and say, they're coming, and they're coming now. Get out and go to a shelter. It's absolutely terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, just to hear it. So, with that being said, what was the strategic value and the impact of the firebombings in you guys' opinions? We could talk about this for hours, and obviously we can't on this particular episode, but I want to hear what you guys think. I have my own opinions, and I'll share those if need be, but I'd like to hear what you guys want to say. What do you guys think about this?
Well, I think, there is a value of doing going into a total war scenario with a civilian population, in that the population gets so decimated that they themselves get tired of the war. They get tired of losing people, losing things, losing their loved ones, to that they put pressure on their governments. So then you as the attacker, or those who are on the offense, are aided in ending the battle by your civilian population. Like you really don't even have to do a whole bunch of fighting yourself. You have the civilians on your side who are just tired of of losing everything, of having no hope. I think Adam and I were talking about this the other day. He's like, this is very similar to, Sherman's March to the Sea, where it's a war of attrition, and you are slashing and burning, and you are getting rid of everything. Right. It's just this really violent action that is forcing people to think like, oh, I don't think I can go through another another month, another year, another 2 years of this, to the point where they're just like, this has to wrap up, or you're going to be fighting your own citizenry on top of fighting an enemy from abroad.
You know, the indiscriminate bombing in Japan lasted for about 6 months, right? So it was, from March until the end of the war in August,
yeah.
right? And during those 6 months, if you include the 2 atomic bomb explosions, well over 1 million Japanese civilians died. 56% of Kobe was destroyed, 50% of Tokyo was destroyed, 99% of Toyama was destroyed. I mean, these are some really large cities in Japan, and they're being devastated. So over 1 million people die. You have another 2, 3, 4 million people just displaced. So you're dealing with a huge humanitarian crisis all within 6 months during the end of a losing war. I mean, it had to be devastating for not only the Japanese government, but also a daunting task for their own civilians to kind of deal with. I think that a strategic value, was it necessary? Probably not, in my opinion. I think that any time that we're willing to destroy an entire civilization is a crime, flat out, just a crime. Those are 1 million lives that the United States took in these bombings, and that's sad that we had to go that far.
Well, I'll respectfully disagree. Was it strategic?
That's why you had me in the room.
That's right. That's right. Was it strategically valuable? Yes, I think it was. And I've, at the risk of sounding like a pompous ass, I've studied this for a very, very long time. And I mean, the end result was what we wanted. We won. And we forced these people to surrender. And Amber, to your point, the civilian population theoretically rising up against their government, that was not going to happen in Japan. Mm-hmm. That wasn't going to happen. It stood a better chance of happening in Nazi Germany, and it did from time to time, than it ever would have in Japan. These people this was a martial population. And I mean, I don't care what people say now. This is a fact. This was a martial population. Their government and military were training children to fight Marines with spears. They were going to fight to the death, and we knew that.
And they depicted that in the film.
Yeah, I was going to say it addresses that in a very subtle way, where the militarism, where the teenage male talks about how his father in the Navy would avenge, and that to me spoke to how exactly what you're saying, how entrenched the militarism.
I mean,
was.
even at the end of the film, after Seda goes through this entire ordeal. At the very end of the film, he's there to withdraw the rest of the money to help save his sister, and he hears about the end of the war, and he's angry about it. So yeah, that deeply entrenched pride, even though it's very briefly seen in children that have been kind of rebelling from that pride from the beginning of the film, that's a shocking kind of symbol of what you're talking about, Seth.
Yeah.
Doesn't that kind of hint at what Japan over time had been, especially in starting from before the war into their imperialism into the rest of Asia, right? So, after Japan's isolationism is forced, Japan is forced open to trade by the Americans, by Perry. The Japanese realize how behind they are with everyone else, and so versus every other big military power around the world. So they're playing catch up and trying to instill this real sense of pride within their population, which had been very feudal beforehand. So they were all kind of broken up into their various camps. So unifying everybody under one singular emperor, and then having a cause for that population to stand behind, which would be our exploration and conquering other Asian countries, specifically Korea, China. You get, of course, the rape of Manchuria in the 1930s with Japanese imperialism, them spreading out and having that whole empire of the sun idea there. But they had to instill that in folks young, right? Because you can't have a population that doesn't believe in the cause. So you start them young to get folks trained in the way that you want them to go, and that's where you get the kids who, that we see later in the film, who are just like Seta. They've been raised in that way. They've been raised to support the emperor and support Japan in this almost rabid kind of way, to the point where they don't want to back down. And unfortunately, that's the way that it worked out.
Yeah, and they weren't going to back down. I mean, even after the atomic bombings, when Emperor Hirohito had said, okay, this is it. We cannot compete with this. We cannot compete with this. This entire country's population is going to be wiped out. There was a revolt. I said there wouldn't happen. There was a revolt in the Japanese army. They were going to try and stop the emperor from making his surrender announcement because they wanted to keep fighting. I mean, and we knew this. I mean, this is a fact. There was a coup, or an attempted coup. And obviously, it did not succeed. But I mean, and we were well aware of this. And the lessons of the Pacific War are very harsh. In that, from the first time we met the Japanese on an offensive basis on Guadalcanal, and they literally butchered our people in front of us, we being the United States, realized that this was not going to be a war of chivalry with the Japanese or the Germans either, for that matter, although there was more in Europe than there was in the Pacific. But, I remember Paul Tibbets saying that there would never have been a Hiroshima if they wouldn't have attacked Pearl Harbor.
Before we leave the subject, I want to recommend to listeners the next time they're at the museum to look carefully for the map in Road to Tokyo in the final room. It's a little easy to overlook because the music's, Brian Eno music's playing, and the atomic bombs are sort of the focus of the room. But there is a panel dedicated to this campaign, and there's a map on the wall there that does comparisons side by side to show how large the cities were.
That's right.
Kobe, Baltimore, and then the percentage of destruction in all the cities. And it's amazing and horrifying what the destruction was. But that was one of the most moving things that I discovered and rediscovered following up on watching this movie. It's an incredibly effective, destructive campaign.
It's fascinating too when you read it and you look at it and you go, good gravy. I mean, even smallish American cities are listed on there, to give you some sort of idea. Well, does the portrayal of the civilians in Kobe provide an accurate representation of civilian life in Japan during and post firebombing campaign? Dave?
I'll take it. And my only reference on this is the short story, which was a first-person account of what survival, a sort of semi-first-person account. I mean, the writer actually was there and lived it. And there's so much detail about acquiring food and the quality of the food that they could acquire, and then the impact of malnutrition and also the personal impact of not having, as orphans, or at least with a distant father, no one could tell them where dad was at sea, at what the struggles were like for a 14-year-old and 4-year-old in the film. In the actual story, the writer's sister, who he was sort of caring for, was only 16 months. Which it would make it even more complicated. So that's my only frame of reference, and I think the others have studied this more than I have.
So I think the film does a really great job at highlighting, similar to what we were just talking about, this idea of nation above self, this nationalistic mindset that civilians were in. And the aunt does that really, really well. Mm-hmm. Every time her daughter would come home from work, she was like, "Well, what did you do for your nation today?" And the husband would come home from work, and she'd be so excited. And then she would call I think Seta was 12 or 14 years old. I mean, he was he was young, right? So he would call this young child, this young teenager, a lazy, a child for not going to work because his steel mill had been bombed. So it wasn't that he wasn't working; it's that his steel mill was already bombed and already out of service. So he didn't have a job, and his school would burn down. So he didn't have anything to do. But yet the aunt still had this deep sense of national pride, and so did Seda, because he carried around his father's picture, and every chance he got, he said, "Oh, my father's in the Navy," and there was a deep sense of pride, and how the Japanese war, kind of translated itself into all these different manifestations within their life. So even though they were struggling with food, the conversation around the dinner table was about the war, and about the successes of their day, and what they did for their nation.
What do you think, Amber?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of piggyback on what Adam just said with the aunt, because she really tripped me up at some parts. Especially when, with her saying, well, Seta, you weren't really doing anything, and you aren't contributing to the war effort and contributing to your country. Well, he contributed to the household. He gave up his mother's kimonos to sell, and which was the only reason why that family was eating for quite a bit, because he did sacrifice something that was a personal connection to him and his sister. Because, I mean, you even see that they took the time to draw the sister holding back the kimonos and telling the aunt, no, those are mommies. You can't take those. I think the film does a really good job of showing the desperation and the struggle to try and maintain some semblance of normalcy, especially for kids, through Seta and Sechiko. The scene of them going to the beach. And him, chasing his sister around, and then playing in the beach with other folks, even turning to look at them, to say, "Well, don't y'all know it's a war going on? Like, why are you playing in the water like that and just having a good time, as if there isn't suffering?" But then we immediately see Sechiko walking over and seeing a dead body that had clearly been there for a while. And Seta turning her around saying, "Oh, don't look at that," and immediately changing the subject. The film does a very, very good job, I think, of just saying, like, yes, there was a war going on. Yes, it was a very bad war, but we also need to realize that there were real people who were affected by this, who weren't military or weren't battle-minded. These were just folks trying to live their day in and day out kind of lives, especially little ones, because war is such an adult subject that we forget sometimes that kids are also very much affected by it when they live in these larger societies and are a part of this. Because could you imagine, like, the trauma that Seta, and I guess by extension Mr. Nosaka, would have felt, having to think about the rest of his life having burned his sister's body and sat and watched it, to make sure that her, like, having to go to the store and buy her coffin, buy the bean pods because they were going to have the best flame, and sit and watch her sister's remains go up in flames. Like, that is traumatic. Could you imagine? I can't. I wouldn't want to imagine, honestly. So I think if anything, the film does a great job of making us think about the horrors of war, especially as young people would have experienced them.
And the film does something else, that it also introduces this narrative of slight doubt, right? So we always make these big blanket statements saying, "Oh, the Japanese people were," and I just made one, right? That Japanese people are deeply nationalistic, and that's true. But if you remember the aunt's husband, I watched the English dubbed version, and the English dubbed version kept calling him that man. So I don't know if the word for husband in Japanese is English translated to man, but that man, right? Whenever that man came home from work, and the aunt is like, "Well, what news of the war?" And he says, "Oh, it's starting to look hopeless," and "Oh, it's starting to look bad." That was a deeply private conversation at their dinner table. So they would never say that in public, right? So that just kind of shows that within the individual homes, that people were starting to doubt a little bit, even if they would have never said it out loud. So I thought that was a really kind of cool additive in there, that little cool thing that was added in.
And I think that would be accurate because the Japanese government did not let anything out.
Right.
They didn't let anything out. They didn't let any kind of failures at all out. But I mean, if you're in Kobe or Tokyo or Nagoya or Yokosuka or whatever it may be, and your city is burned down night after night, it's pretty obvious things aren't going very well, and whether the government says, no, we got this or not, it's pretty obvious. And I agree. I thought that was kind of cool. And I also thought it was pretty dang accurate that they were showing the lack of food, and there's something, you think about when you think of the bombing of Germany, and this is true. There was a lack of food there too, a great deal. But for whatever reason, you don't really think about that very often when you think about the bombing of Japan, that these people were starving. And that was part of the goal, was to starve these people out into submission. I mean, we weren't trying to starve the population to death, but we were trying to starve them into submission.
I think I read somewhere that it was actually called Operation Starvation. It wasn't mining the harbors and waterways.
Yes.
Actually.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I was going to get to, is that one of the main purposes for the United States Submarine Service in late 44, 45, was to sink anything that floated around the Japanese home islands. And of course, we didn't get everything, but we did a dang good job and sank a lot of shit. I mean, crying out loud, submarines were surfacing and shooting up sampans, full of fish or fishermen, fishermen's sampans. And I mean, that was all part of the greater strategy, and you're right, it was Operation Starvation. That's exactly right. But the submarines factored into that as well. And we were trying to, as I said, force these people to realize that you are not going to win. You are an island nation. We got you surrounded, and you're going to lose. And it unfortunately took a lot of innocent people dying to get that message across.
Yeah, and the film kind of subtly plays at that idea at the very beginning, whenever the ant is scraping the bottom of the pot and eating the burnt part of the rice. Everyone throws that part away, but that part of the rice.
If you're hungry.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Not if you're hungry. So she's scraping the bottom of that pot and she's sneaking some for herself, and so it starts hinting at this idea of starvation coming pretty early in the film.
Mm-hmm. And then they sort of throw it in your face once Seita and his sister are living in the cave, and you come across those little boys who find their cave and are like, ugh, they're eating bugs, they're eating frogs. I would never eat a frog. Well, you have to when you're hungry and you need to eat. Frog tastes pretty good, more so than having nothing.
So one of the things, one of the talking points that was sent around before we started this was the children's father was on the Japanese ship, the Maya, and the question was asked, was it a real ship? And it was. The Maya was a Imperial Japanese Navy heavy cruiser. She was a Takeo class heavy cruiser, commissioned in 1932. At the time, when she was actually for a better part of the war, really, up until about 44, that class of cruiser was considered one of the most powerful class of heavy cruisers in the world. They were built specifically to counter American heavy cruisers in an upcoming Pacific War. I mean, Japan was preparing for this for a very long time, and it was a real ship, and it saw a lot of combat action. It was part of the shore bombardment force for the invasion of the Philippines in December 1941. It was not part of the Pearl Harbor Task Force, obviously, if it was in the Philippines. It was part of the invasion force for the Aleutians in June of 1942. At the same time the Battle of Midway was going on, it was up doing the same thing, bombarding shore targets in the Aleutians. She saw a lot of action around Guadalcanal. She was at Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz. She bombarded Henderson Field, bombarded the Marines at Henderson Field at least twice that we know of, probably estimated 3 or 4 times, but at least twice. And she saw service all the way until 1944. She was in Philippine Sea, and it was a well-known ship. She'd been attacked and damaged by American aircraft twice up until 1944. Nothing serious, but enough to send her back to the yard for repairs. She was hit by some naval artillery a couple of times, and a submarine took a shot at her once and missed her. And then on October 23rd, 1944, in the Philippines, she was torpedoed by the submarine USS Dace, which was SS-247. And I got the story here. I'll read this real quick. At about 0550 hours, the Maya received 4 hits on the port side, 1 in the forward chain locker, 1 opposite number 1 turret, 1 in the number 7 boiler room, and the last one in the aft engine room. So, I mean, this thing was a goner. Secondary explosions disabled her by 0600. That's 10 minutes later. And she sank 5 minutes later to port. 336 men died in the sinking, including the commanding officer. 700, and this is where fate is really nasty, 769 were rescued by a destroyer, and some of the survivors were put aboard the Japanese super battleship Masashi, which was the Yamato's sister ship, and the Masashi was sunk the next day. 143 of those were lost when Masashi was sunk. So, yeah, that's kind of cool. I mean, it's a direct tie to an actual historical vessel. And sometimes in a lot of movies when they make, I forget what movie it was, we did, Run Silent, Run Deep, when they did the Akakazi. And there was a real ship, but I think it was, it might have just been, happenstance that it was connected. But this is real, and this was a real connection. So it was kind of cool.
I thought it was a great device.
Yeah.
In that it was a direct connection for the boy. I mean, he carried the photo of his father with him to the very end. And to me, that's spoke so strongly about the culture and the family and the fact that it was a real ship. It was just another way into the film for me. I was able to research that and learn more about what the father's service would have been like.
And she was a well-known ship, too. I mean, there were the Japanese had a very, very, very powerful Navy, really up until about 44 when, they had more ships than airplanes to fly off of the decks of the aircraft carriers. But so it was a deep sense of pride for the Japanese people was their Navy. And Maya was a well-known vessel. I mean, you hear about ships like the Yamato and the carrier Akagi and things like that. They're very famous, but she'd been around a long time. And so she had, she'd made the headlines a few times, I'm sure, in Japan. So it was a well-known vessel.
Is she where Paul Allen's crew might find her?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she is.
So my main question with that is so the Maya sunk in October 44.
Yeah.
Bombings on Kobe begin February 45-ish, February, March 45.
February 14th.
So that's several months that the family doesn't know that their father's dead. So, I mean, does the Japanese have the same type of desire to let families know about losses like the United States did, where you see the
Western Union
men. The Western Union men come down the street? I mean, is there a similar kind of delivery system of news in Japan at the same time?
There is to a point, but not when it comes to the Navy. The Japanese did not want to they didn't want to let anybody know that they lost a ship. B, they didn't want to let us know that they had lost a ship. Because, I mean, a lot of times, you put torpedo, unless you visibly see it go down, you think it went down, but you don't know. And I mean, the Japanese claim that the Enterprise, they sunk the carrier Enterprise 6 times. And the only time it sunk is when we scrapped it in 1958.
Right.
So, I mean, it's one of those things that it was an intelligence thing, too. They didn't want to broadcast it because, we had our spies, too. That, oh, hey, yeah, the Maya was sunk, or the Yamato, or they knew the Yamato was sunk. But you get what I'm driving at here. They didn't want to let that out. But again, they also didn't want to admit the loss of the ship to the people. So the fact that these kids didn't know that their father was dead, and this would have been, what did I say, October? So November, December, 4, 5, 6 months, and then beyond, obviously, all the way to the surrender. That's accurate. That's accurate. I mean, at that point, you're going to, when Dad doesn't return home post-war,
yeah, right. Because, I mean, technically the father has already been sunk before the film even begins.
Oh, yeah.
Because if it picks up in, February 45, then that ship has already been sunk. So no one knows about it.
Right.
So that was really surprising to me because we're so familiar with this idea of the Western Union man coming down the street and knocking on doors of all your neighbors. And that's a really touching story on the home front of the United States. But we didn't see that in this film with the Japanese home front.
Yeah. And I mean, truth be told, I mean, the Japanese did admit to ships being sunk sometimes years after. I mean, the 4 carriers were sunk at Midway in June of 42. They didn't admit to it until 44.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Although, I mean, to be honest, neither did we.
Yeah.
We lost the Hornet in October of 42. We didn't mention it until, I think, January or February of 43. So.
And lots of fathers on those ships.
Oh, yeah. Too many.
Yeah.
So how does this story compare to other tales of children in wartime, like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, Life is Beautiful, Empire of the Sun, Hope and Glory, stuff like that. What's your opinion on this?
I think it fits the narrative of kids always trying to be kids at the end of the day. Like specifically thinking about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was a film that really struck me when I originally saw it and then became like almost obsessed with it and reading the book and following up with it. Because you have the characters in that where you have a little boy whose father is a German officer and who befriends a young man who is unfortunately in a concentration camp and is destined to be gassed, but not realizing that, it's just the fact that he's dressed really weird. He's dressed in these really funny pajamas, but he's another little boy, and I'm trapped here, very isolated without other children. Let me go play with him. And let me eventually, not to spoil the plot of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, but, going so desperate to have a connection to another child that you end up dying because of it. I think this film is in the interaction between Seta and his little sister is really just heart-wrenching when you just realize that even when they don't understand, especially like Seta's little sister, just not getting that, mommy's dead. She's not coming back, and there's really nothing that we can do. But I still have to raise you. Like, I'm your brother. I still have to take care of you. I think that in comparison, this movie definitely stands up to any of those that go into a child's lived experience during the war, because it's just such a hard thing to, I think, get across, especially as an adult, as somebody who, unless you have lived through that kind of experience, it's hard for those of us who haven't to really understand the real tragedy that is being a child during this time.
I think one of the biggest distinguishing factors is that it's animation, and that and in fact, the author Nosaka said this is a story that could only be told with animation. They've tried a couple of live action versions of it, but the fact that it is stylized and in many ways whimsical, it does capture the moments when the children are just being children, and the fact that it's animation removes some emotion, but it also heightens it in some ways. So that's my observation about it. I can't imagine a live action version of this. The animation was so effective and beautiful, and I had no experience with anime to speak of at all, but the fact that it was drawings, cartoons, was moved me in ways I didn't expect to be moved.
So what I found really interesting was it reminded us all that children really have a deeper understanding of their own experiences than we as adults would assume. She as Setsuko was digging the grave for the firefly, she says, "Oh, mommy's in a grave too." And so she connected death with burial, pretty seamlessly. So children are very much aware of their own surroundings, and they take their own experiences and kind of create these spaces where they can understand more. So with Seta and Setsuka, it was the fireflies, right? It's this idea of these fireflies have died, so they must be buried now, just like mom, right? So it was really cool that it showed how aware they were of this tragedy that they were living.
Good points. How do you think this film fits into Japan's cultural approach to the war at the time of its release in '88? So, this is, 33 years after the end of the war. 43 years after the end of my math. This is why I'm a historian. I'm not good at math. But good Lord. So anyway, back to my point. How do you think this film fits into Japan's cultural approach to the war?
Well, that's one of the things I've thought about since I saw it, and it's all the conversation is about war and popular memory. The short story was written and published in '67, so that's 20 years removed. The film was 20 plus years after that. The cities had been rebuilt.
Sure.
Japan was a modern country by the time the film arrived. but to revisit what most people who had been born since the war only know through relative stories, it would probably be hard. It's just much like the stories we tell at the museum, where it's hard to believe that 20-year-olds went around the world and did what they did. It's hard to believe if you're a contemporary modern person in the late 1980s in rebuilt Japan, what life was like and what Japanese culture was like at the time of the war. And I think the film does a good job of subtly conveying that. Does that answer the question, or did I completely veer there?
No.
What's interesting is how far removed the original writer was from the war. It took him 20 years to reckon with those events in that time, and then the filmmakers came along 20 years after
20
that.
years later.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really kind of shows what Japanese public memory of the war was like in the immediate post-war period, and really kind of until you get to Generation X or so, there's this really deep sense of shame about what occurred. There really is. There's not much in terms of public memory, especially of government-sanctioned public memory of how the Japanese interpret the war itself until later periods. So especially like 1988 is the perfect time for this film to have come out because you're a whole generation, maybe even two, a little bit away from that immediate memory of the war. And so you have a group of young adults and folks who are approaching middle age who are just like, we need to talk about this. This is important, an important part of our history, and we need to rectify with it because we lost an entire generation of kids and adults to this war. It was such an important part of our history, and it's time that we rectify that. So in the 80s and onward into the 90s and 2000s, that's when we start to get this public memory of World War II that pops up in Japanese culture and society and history books and interpretation. So it makes sense for this film to have been made at the time that it was made. It tells you about what is going on in Japanese society in rectifying with this memory about that time.
So I think one thing to add too is that this film really humanizes the Japanese people. This is after 1988. This is after World War II. This is after Korea. This is after Vietnam, all where the United States are fighting Asiatic peoples, all where propaganda was framing people in Asia as monsters and as communists and as evil and all these other things that we see, especially during World War II. So 1988 is a perfect time for this film to come out because it really does humanize the Japanese people. And even though this was largely for a Japanese audience, we're talking about it right now in America specifically because it has an impactful story. So I think that's another really good facet of this, is that it changes the narrative of what we think and what historically we've thought of Japanese people as.
I think it's accurate in that, the vast majority of the Japanese population who had experienced World War II, who were still living at this time, this is what they remember. They remember the bombings. They remember the fire bombings. They remember the atomic attacks and things like that. They don't remember Guadalcanal, Midway, Iwo Jima, whatever. And there's many reasons for that, not the least of which is that, the Japanese survivors of those events, of which there were few, very few, when they did come home, they were shamed. And I think it was you, Amber, who said, that there was a national shame, and there was a national shame in that, when the survivors did come home, they were ostracized. And not only were they completely broken people because they had been indoctrinated with this, warped sense of Bushido that, to be captured or surrender is worse than death. And here they are, they'd been captured and they surrendered as a nation. And now they're home and their victors are, parading down their streets. They didn't talk about it. They didn't come home like American Marines and soldiers and sailors and talk about it. And really our people didn't start talking about it till the 80s anyway. But my point is that they really weren't talking about it. The Germans talked about it more than the Japanese did. And so, this is what the Japanese civilian population at that time remembered from World War II, right or wrong. And I think it's a little bit of right and a little bit of wrong because and Japanese World War II history, if you will, they neglect to talk about the horrendous crimes that their people committed. I mean, animalistic crimes. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I'm not going to get into it now, but the rape of Nanking, go pick up a book and read about it. The treatment of prisoners of war. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on. But they neglect that conveniently, which really, really, really irritates me. But that being said, this is what people at that time would have remembered who would not have served in the military. So to that regard, I think it's an accurate representation of that time and Japan. The title of the movie is called Grave of the Fireflies, and fireflies are obviously an important part in this story. It's symbolic, I think, but how do you interpret the use of the fireflies, Adam?
So in each little vignette, because really this film is just a series of vignettes or a series of experiences. And in each of those little vignettes, the fireflies, I think, represent something different. So it started out with early on with the fireflies representing the bombings, with the the swarm of little light up bombs that are falling on the cities, and then later on they came to symbolize the innocence of civilians and the innocence of children, because the children were playing with the fireflies and the mosquito netting, and then the death of those fireflies and how children kind of cope with death that's surrounding them. They use the firefly as kind of an element to tell that story. And then later, the firefly really comes to represent the despair and the desperation of the starving people, and and ultimately becoming kind of this. I think we used the word shepherd earlier. The shepherd through this story and through what we already know is Seita and Suseko's afterlife, right? Kind of their last fleeting glimpse of their life.
What about you?
Yeah, I'm just piggybacking on that last part that Adam said. The fireflies. I mean, they're the first thing we see when the film starts, after, especially after Seita passes, and they are really sort of they're shepherding him back to his sister in the afterlife, and then as he is passing on, they're riding with. Seita and Setsuko are riding with fireflies on that train through their life story as they're kind of flashing through the last bits of their life. But also the fireflies do sort of highlight things that they don't necessarily say in the film, but they want us to pay attention to. So specifically thinking about the scene where Setsuko is burying the fireflies, and Seita is saying, "Oh yeah, Mom is buried in that really nice graveyard that's near home." Well, no, she wasn't. He was carrying her with them, her ashes, in that little box that the firefly then comes and highlights later in that scene. So we're getting both a shepherding feeling from the fireflies, but they also are hinting at these things that a child wouldn't have known. Seita did, because he was trying to protect his baby sister, but they're wanting to show us that there's a lot more complications with this story than what can be said.
I loved it and read it as a poetic device all the way through. The flying embers were those, But I also, for some perverse reason, read it as literal. Fire does fly, and that's how the story starts. I doubt that was the writer's meaning, but that's how it struck me. And it's a recurring device that I think it makes the film a thoughtful experience, partly.
I never thought of that. It's pretty cool. The fire does fly, and it does. It does. It really does.
Until it lands.
That is true. Well, Dave, I'm going to go back around the horn. I'll start with you. Did you like it, and would you recommend this movie?
I did, and I would. I'll defer to Roger Ebert, who reviewed it in 2000 for one of the DVD releases. But his final thought in what he wrote about it was more of an essay where he quoted other critics. But he says, "Yes, it's a cartoon, and the kids have eyes like saucers, but it belongs on any list of the greatest war films ever made. I don't know enough about the canon of war films, but this is one of the most unique war films I've ever seen, and it tells a story that's hard to access in other places in other ways. And so I was thrilled to learn about this film and get a chance to learn more about it. And I learned a lot here today, too. So,
Amber?
Thank you all.
Yeah, I really like this film. I think it's an accessible way for us to talk about an experience that we don't usually talk about, especially not here at the museum, and that's the Japanese civilian experience. I think a lot of people discredit animated films just on virtue of what they are. They associate cartoons and animation with children, but it's a really an interesting medium that we can, like Dave was saying earlier, you can let things be said and shown in a way that you wouldn't be able to do with live action. It's the first real war movie that I think I ever actually sat down and watched because I was a real anime nerd, a true weeb.
I was counting on one of us to be that.
Yeah,
so
it was the true weeb in the room, and it's one of the ones that really stuck out in my head to really think about. Well, yeah, I know a little bit about this war. My dad has all these real boring old John Wayne movies in the basement on VHS. That's about this, but coming at it from a different perspective really made the story come alive to me as somebody, and it stuck with me for years until I watched it again this past weekend in preparation for this talk. So I would recommend folks watching it. I would recommend adults watching it with their children and helping them put it in context, but also look at the ways in which your children interpret it as well, because they're going to look at it a little bit differently than you do. So,
Adam?
I'll start by saying that I have very little interaction with Japanese anime outside of, like the Dragon Ball Z cartoons whenever I was a teenager. Yeah. So I was initially shocked at how human the characters looked, because I was so used to seeing, the Dragon Ball Z type of exaggerated figures that you see in these types of cartoons. With that said, I didn't hate it, but I'm still on the fence on whether or not I liked it and would recommend it. I watched it twice to kind of get ready for this chat that we're having now, and I didn't hate it either time.
But you didn't love it.
But I didn't love it. Yeah, I didn't love it.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with you. Did I like it? Honestly, no, I did not. I did not like the movie. That's just my personal taste. I'm not a fan of anime. I like animation, but I'm not a fan of anime, and that's just me. I like classical animation, and you're right, Amber. Not all animation does pertain to children, or is targeted towards children. I mean, Bugs Bunny cartoons, frankly, were not. But
well, I mean, all of Adult Swim. That's
right.
Oh yeah, very, very.
And I'm sure that's copyrighted, so we may have to edit that out. But
also, it's Bugs Bunny, But no, I got to say, I did not care for this movie at all. And would I recommend it? Well, I would recommend you read about the subject. Yes. Read a book about the firebombing in Japan. There's a fantastic book by Barrett Tillman written called Whirlwind, and it's about the bombing campaign, the strategic bombing campaign of Japan. It's a good book, and it's a fascinating subject. It really is a sad subject, obviously, but it's a fascinating subject. I just don't think that this movie is gonna teach you a whole heck of a lot about the firebombing in Japan, if that's what you want to learn about. So I would not recommend it on those grounds. But
but certainly read the short story.
Sure,
I really enjoyed the short story.
I will second that. I did read the short story that Dave sent, or that Tessa sent, because Dave found it, and that was cool. I liked that. I got to be honest, that was good. But the movie, not so much. Final thoughts. Dave, can you sum it up?
We've warned. I think people have been warned. People who are regular listeners of the podcast will know that this is not the kind of film that we talk about here every week. This is a different perspective on an important piece of history, and nonetheless, I'd recommend it.
Amber?
This film is a different way of going about this very difficult history and understanding it from a different perspective. Are you going to get the nuts and bolts of the battles and the hows and the whys and the wins? No. But if you want to get a civilian's take on, especially a child's take on a very traumatic time, I would suggest taking a look at this film.
Adam?
It's a vitally important story, but I think there are better mediums that discuss it. However, if you like animation and anime, for being a 1980 film, the animation is pretty good. It was, I thought that was really cool. The technique of the animation seemed really cool. But again, I didn't hate it, but it was all right.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Adam. I think that was well put, is that if you want to learn about this, there are better mediums than this film. And again, that's just my opinion. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini episode next week where we will share oral histories from those who were there. Not on the ground, but in the air. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. As I said before, you can find Service on Celluloid now on Stitcher, as well as iTunes and SoundCloud. Do us a favor and be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. And while I'm at it, I'd like to thank Justine S. for leaving us a review a couple of weeks ago. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.